Welcome back to Gman Reviews. Today we're talking about Felicity from Evil West, and more specifically the philosophy behind her character. But before we get into Felicity West, let's explain quickly what Evil West is for anyone who has not played it. So Evil West is a third-person action game set in a dark fantasy version of the American frontier. Think cowboys, vampires, secret monster hunting organizations, steampunk weapons, electric gauntlets, and supernatural horror, basically involving vampires, all smashed together into one very over-the-top action game. So you play as Jesse Rentier, a member of the Rentier Institute, which is basically a monster hunting organization dedicated to defending humanity from vampires and other creatures hiding in the shadows of the Old West. So the basic conflict of the game is humanity versus vampires, but the story is not just about shooting monsters. Underneath the blood, guns, electricity, and vampire horror, Evil West is also about power, survival, legacy, and whether violence can be used to protect civilization without becoming monstrous itself. And that brings us to Felicity D'Abano. On the surface, Felicity looks like a fairly straightforward vampire villain. She's powerful, cruel, aristocratic, and monstrous. She stands against Jesse Rentier and the Rentier Institute, and by the end of the game, she becomes one of the clearest examples of what the heroes are fighting against. But I think there is more going on with her than just being the evil vampire boss, right? Felicity represents a very specific kind of villain philosophy. She's what happens when pain turns into ideology. She's what happens when someone looks at a cruel world and decides that mercy is weakness. She's what happens when someone who was once powerless becomes powerful, but instead of using that strength to protect the weak, they use it to dominate them. So today I want to ask a simple question. Is Felicity just a monster, or is she a warning about what happens when trauma becomes tyranny? Spoiler warning for Evil West, especially Felicity's role in the story and her transformation later into the game. Let's get into it. So who is Felicity? So Felicity D'Abano is one of the central vampire villains in Evil West. She is tied to Peter Debano and the Sanguisuge, don't quote me on the pronunciation of that, the vampire enemy faction in the game. But Felicity is not just a random vampire noble standing around waiting for a boss fight. Her backstory matters. Felicity's hatred of humanity is connected to suffering, abuse, powerlessness, and being discarded by the human world before she became something far more dangerous. That matters because her villainy is not just about hunger. It is not just about blood. It is not just about being a vampire. Her worldview is built around what she experienced before she became powerful. She knows what it means to be weak. She knows what it means to be helpless. She knows what it means to be beneath the boot of a cruel world. But here is the tragic part. Instead of looking at that suffering and saying, no one else should have to go through this, Felicity seems to have come to a very different conclusion. She looks at weakness and decides weakness deserves to be crushed. That is where her philosophy becomes dangerous, because there are two ways a character can respond to pain. One path is compassion, the other path is domination. Felicity chooses domination, and that choice is what makes her more than just another vampire monster. The core behind Felicity's philosophy. The central idea behind Felicity's worldview is this: the world is cruel, so the strong should rule it. That is the basic shape of her philosophy. She does not really believe in redemption. She does not believe in coexistence. She does not believe in mercy as a serious moral force. She believes in power. And to be fair, that is why she is interesting as a villain, because she is not completely irrational. She is wrong, but she is not random. Felicity looks at human society and sees corruption, hypocrisy, violence, and abuse. Based on her own experience, she has plenty of reason to believe the world is rotten. But instead of rejecting cruelty, she adopts it. Instead of saying, the world is cruel, so I will fight cruelty, she says, the world is cruel, so I will become stronger than everyone else. That is the key difference. That is the why Felicity works as a villain. She's not just a monster because she has fangs. She's a monster because she turns suffering into permission. Permission to dominate, permission to mutate, permission to kill, permission to replace one cruel order with another. Felicity's philosophy is not justice. It is revenge dressed up as destiny. Humanity as corruption. One of the most important parts of Felicity's worldview is that she sees humanity as corrupt beyond saving. She does not look at humans and see innocent people worth protecting. She sees a species that abused her, rejected her, and built a society where the weak are preyed upon. And again, this is where the writing becomes more interesting than a simple good versus evil setup. Because Felicity is not entirely wrong about the world of evil, that the world of evil west is ugly. That is not a clean, noble, peaceful world. It is a brutal version of the American frontier filled with monsters, secret wars, hidden institutions, technology, blood, violence, and corruption. Humanity in Evil West is not presented as perfectly innocent. There are selfish people, there are cruel people, there are power structures, there is exploitation. So Felicity identifies a real problem, but her answer is monstrous. She does not say humanity is corrupt, so we need moral reform. She says humanity is corrupt, so vampires should rule. That is an important distinction. A hero can look at corruption and try to protect the innocent from it. A villain looks at corruption and uses it as an excuse to become worse. Felicity belongs to the second category. She sees evil in the world and decides evil must be the winning side. Power is justice. The second part of Felicity's philosophy is the belief that power is the only real justice. This is where her character becomes especially dark. Because Felicity was once weak, she does not become sympathetic toward the weak. She becomes disgusted by weakness. That is a very villainous transformation. A heroic character who survives suffering often says, I know what pain feels like, so I will protect others from it. But Felicity's response is more like, I know what weakness feels like, so I will never be weak again, and anyone who remains weak deserves what happens to them. That is not healing. That is corruption, and it makes her a mirror image of a lot of heroic characters. Think about Jesse Rentier. Jesse is also shaped by violence. He lives in a brutal world. He is trained to fight monsters. He lost his mother. He inherits the burden of the Rentier Institute. He's not exactly a soft character, but Jesse's violence is aimed at defending humanity from predators. Felicity's violence is aimed at turning herself and her kind into the ultimate predators. That is the moral divide. Both characters use power, but Jesse's power is defensive. Felicity's power is imperial. That is why the conflict is not just human versus vampire. It is protector versus predator. Survival justifies conquest. The third part of Felicity's philosophy is survivalism. She believes vampires and humans are heading toward inevitable war, and from her perspective, that is not a completely foolish belief. The Rentier Institute is developing advanced weapons. Humanity is becoming more dangerous. Felicity D'Abano in the story is talking about how humans will eventually, how their technology will become so powerful that they will eventually be able to do aside with the magic that the vampires used called the glamour, which they used to hide themselves. Right? So the old vampire, like I said, humanity is becoming more dangerous, and the old vampire order cannot simply hide forever. The balance of power is shifting. So Felicity and the vampire aristocracy are not just acting out of hunger. They are acting out of fear. But fear does not excuse tyranny. This is where Felicity's thinking becomes very familiar. Her argument is basically, if we do not dominate them first, they will destroy us. That is preemptive conquest. And history, fiction, and real life are full of tyrants who justify evil this way. They do not say we are doing evil because we enjoy evil. They say we had no choice, it was necessary, it was survival, they would have done it to us, we are only doing what must be done. This is what makes Felicity dangerous. She has a philosophy that can justify anything. Once survival becomes the highest good, morality becomes optional. Once victory becomes more important than virtue, there is no limit. That is why Felicity's transformation is not just physical. It is philosophical. She becomes embody what she already is in spirit, a creature that believes power is the only truth. Felicity and the vampire aristocracy. Another interesting part of Felicity is that she is tied to the vampire aristocracy. That matters because vampires often represent more than just monsters. In a lot of fiction, vampires represent predatory elites. They are old, they are wealthy, they are seductive, they are powerful, they feed on ordinary people while presenting themselves as superior. Felicity fits into that tradition, but with a twist. She was not always part of that elite. She came from suffering and was brought into it. That makes her even more interesting. She's not simply born into power. She is adopted into power, transformed by power, and then becomes one of its fiercest defenders. That gives her a kind of convert's zeal. She does not just believe vampires are powerful, she believes vampiric power saved her from human weakness. So when she looks at humans, she does not see what the people like she once was. She sees what she escaped, and that is tragic, because Felicity could have become a protector of the vulnerable. She could have remembered what it felt like to be helpless. She could have used power to defend those trapped under cruelty, but instead she joins the predators. That is one of the oldest moral failures in storytelling. The victim who survives oppression gains power and then recreates oppression with themselves at the top. That is Felicity. She does not destroy the cruelty that hurt her, she inherits it. Felicity versus Jesse Rentier. The strongest way to understand Felicity is to compare her with Jesse Rentier. Jesse and Felicity both belong to violent worlds. Neither of them is naive. Neither of them lives in some peaceful moral fantasy where everything can be solved with a nice speech. They both understand blood, monsters, weapons, and war, but the difference is what they think power is for. For Jesse, power is duty. He does not always want the responsibility placed on him. He has conflict with his father. He has to grow into the role. But ultimately, Jesse's violence is tied to protection. He's not fighting because he wants to rule humanity. He's fighting because something monstrous is threatening humanity. Felicity, on the other hand, sees power as entitlement. Her logic is not the strong must protect the weak. Her logic is the strong deserve to rule the weak. That is the whole difference between a warrior and a tyrant. A warrior uses strength in service of something higher. A tyrant treats strength as the highest thing. That is why Felicity cannot be the hero of her own story, even if she has a tragic past. A tragic past can explain a villain. It does not excuse them. This is important because modern storytelling sometimes confuses explanation with justification. A villain can have pain. A villain can have trauma. A villain can have a reason, but a reason is not the same thing as moral innocence. Felicity's pain explains why she hates the world. It does not justify her desire to dominate it. The Rentier Institute and the moral risk of monster hunting. There is another layer here too, because Evil West does not present the heroes as gentle pacifists. The Rentier Institute is violent, it is secretive, it uses advanced weapons, it fights monsters in the shadows. And Jesse himself is not exactly a saintly figure floating above the brutality of the world. He is a fighter, he is a killer. He uses technology, guns, electricity, and raw force to destroy enemies. So the question is not, is violence ever used in Evil West? Of course it is. The better question is, what is the violence used for? This is where moral difference matters. The Rentier Institute uses violence to protect human civilization from predatory monsters. Felicity uses violence to establish predatory rule over humanity. That is a huge difference. That is why stories about monster hunters often have an interesting moral tension. The monster hunter has to become dangerous enough to fight monsters without becoming a monster themselves. That is the line that Jesse has to walk. And Felicity represents what happens when that line is completely abandoned. She does not fight monsters, she becomes the philosophy of monstrosity. Her final transformation. Felicity's final monstrous transformation is one of the clearest symbols of her philosophy. She does not become stronger, she does not become less human, less restrained, or more consumed by the very power she worships. That matters because in good monster stories, the monster form usually reveals the inner truth of the character. The outside catches up with the inside. Felicity believes power is everything, so she sacrifices herself to power. She believes humanity is weakness, so she abandons humanity completely. She believes morality is beneath survival, so her body becomes a symbol of appetite, mutation, and domination. That is why her final form works thematically. It is not just a boss fight, it is a philosophy made flesh. She wanted to become something above humanity. Instead, she becomes something beneath morality. That is a strong villain image. Because the promise of power is always the same. Become stronger and you will be free. Because in Felicity's case, power does not free her, it consumes her. The tragedy of Felicity. So, what is the tragedy of Felicity? It is not simply that she suffered, it is that she learned the wrong lesson from suffering. That is the heart of her character. Pain can teach compassion, but pain can also teach cruelty. If someone suffers and concludes, "No one helped me, so I will help others," that can create a hero. But if someone suffers and concludes, "No one helped me, so no one deserves help," that can create a villain. Felicity is the second path. She is the person who looks at a broken world and decides the answer is not healing, the answer is control. Not mercy, domination. Not justice, revenge. And that is why she is more frightening than a simple monster. Because if philosophy is human, you do not need to be a vampire to think this way. People can fall into this mindset whenever they start believing their pain gives them permission to hurt others. That is the warning that Felicity represents. Suffering does not automatically make someone noble. It can make someone bitter. It can make someone cruel. It can make someone hungry for control. And unless that pain is disciplined by virtue, it can become something monstrous. What Felicity gets right. Now, to be fair, a good villain usually has at least one piece of truth, and Felicity does. She is right that the world is cruel. She is right that humans can be corrupt. She is right that power matters. She is right that pretending evil does not exist is foolish. But she takes those truths and builds the wrong philosophy from them. That is what makes her dangerous. A lie mixed with truth is often more persuasive than a plain lie. If Felicity simply said, "I want to hurt people because I enjoy it," she would be much less interesting. But instead, her worldview has structure. She can say, "The world hurt me, humanity is corrupt, the strong survive, war is inevitable, so we must rule before we are destroyed." That is a believable villain logic. But believable does not mean moral, and that is where the hero has to reject her worldview. Not by pretending the world is nice, but by choosing to fight for something better anyway. That is the key. The heroic answer to Felicity is not naive optimism. The heroic answer is disciplined courage. It is the belief that yes, the world is cruel, but that does not give us permission to become crueler. Why Felicity works as a villain? Felicity works because she is not just opposing Jesse physically. She is opposing him morally. She represents the temptation to answer monsters by becoming one. She represents the idea that being hurt gives you the right to hurt others. She represents a world where mercy is considered weakness and domination is considered honesty. And that is a philosophy worth challenging. Because in a violent world, the easiest thing to do is become hard. The harder thing is to remain principled. Jesse's world is full of monsters, but his job is not just to kill them. His job is to avoid becoming one. That is why Felicity is such a good contrast. She shows what happens when someone crosses that line completely. She does not just become a monster physically, she becomes morally monstrous first. The transformation simply reveals what was happening already inside her. The bigger moral lesson. The bigger lesson of Felicity is this: trauma explains pain, but it does not sanctify cruelty. That is the line I would take away from her character. You can understand why Felicity hates the world. You can understand why she distrusts humanity. You can understand why power seems attractive to someone who once had none. But understanding is not the same as approval. A moral life requires more than surviving pain. It requires deciding what kind of person you will become after pain. And that is where Felicity fails. She survives suffering, but she does not overcome it. She becomes ruled by it. She lets the cruelty done to her become the blueprint for the cruelty she does to others. That is why she is that tragic. That is why she is evil. Why this matters in Beyond Evil West. I think this is why Felicity is worth talking about, even if Evil West is mostly remembered as a stylish action about punching vampires with an electric gauntlet. Because good genre fiction can still contain some moral ideas, serious moral ideas. A vampire story does not have to be subtle to be meaningful. A cowboy monster hunting game does not have to be quiet or artsy to say something about power, cruelty, and corruption. Felicity is interesting because she takes a very human temptation and gives it monstrous form. The temptation is this: I was hurt, therefore I am owed power. That is a dangerous idea because once someone believes their pain gives them moral permission, almost anything can be justified. Revenge can be called justice, control can be called safety, cruelty can be called honesty, domination can be called survival. That is Felicity's path. It is a path that the story ultimately rejects. The answer to a cruel world is not to become more cruel than everyone else. The answer is to become strong enough to protect what cruelty tries to destroy. That is the difference between strength and tyranny. Strength protects, tyranny consumes. Conclusion. So, is Felicity from Evil West just a monster? No. She's a monster, but she's not just a monster. She's a warning. She is a warning about what happens when pain becomes an ideology. She's a warning about what happens when survival becomes an excuse for domination. She's a warning about what happens when someone sees evil in the world and decides evil must be the winning side. And that is why I think Felicity is more interesting than she first appears. Because underneath the vampire horror, the aristocratic cruelty, and the monstrous transformation, there is a very human failure. She was hurt. she became powerful, and instead of using that power to protect others, she used it to become the thing people needed protection from. That is the tragedy of Felicity. She did not just become a vampire, she became a tyrant. And that's my take on Felicity from Evil West, and why her philosophy is more interesting than just evil vampire villain. If you enjoyed this kind of character analysis, let me know, because I'd like to do more episodes looking at the morality, philosophy, and storytelling behind video game characters. And if you played Evil West, I'd be interested to hear what you think. Do you see Felicity as a tragic villain? Do you see her as pure evil? Or do you think the game could have done more with her philosophy and backstory? You can also check out gaming essays and reviews over at gmanreviews.blog, where I break down games, characters, factions, and the deeper ideas behind them, which you'll see a link in the description below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you on the next one.